I know you mentioned on your website that some of the more influential books in your life have been like The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant,
Mm,
Childhood End, The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell, which I'm familiar
sure,
with.
sure.
Um, what makes those books specifically so influential to you as a reader and as a writer?
Yeah. So, when I was a kid, I didn't like to read a lot. Um, like I loved being read to, like as a little kid, but it took me quite a while to actually find books that I wanted to read. And Childhood's End, I think I was in middle school, was probably one of the first books that really turned me on to reading. And Childhood's End is a science fiction novel. I think it was written like in the 1950s by Arthur C. Clarke. Basically just about this alien race called the Overlords that comes to Earth, and they basically say, "You got to stop all this fighting. Um, you can't do it anymore. We're all going to get along, but we're going to kind of manage things, right?" So it was kind of this, relatively hands off. They weren't there to like take over, but they were like, you can't act the way you've been acting, right? And I don't know, it just had a real impact on me. And that kinda got the ball rolling, and then, a little bit later, I ran across other science fiction and fantasy books because that was my wheelhouse. Everybody has a wheelhouse that they tend to gravitate towards, and that was just mine, right? And, yeah, you mentioned The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. It's a fantasy series by Stephen R. Donaldson. Something spoke to me about those novels. It's about this guy who, um he's a leper, right? And so he has this incurable disease, and he ends up stumbling in front of a police car, and, s he thinks, "Well, this is it. That's my life." But then he wakes up, and he's in this different alternative kind of reality, this place called the Land, where he's all healed, and he's kind of the savior. People look to him to, like, to save their world, right? And it just spoke to me, right? I don't exactly know why, but it just did, right? But then, yeah, those were the touchstones for me, and then I kind of went on and explored, other parts of those genres, and I like all kinds of writing now. I mean, I don't just read fantasy and science fiction, but I almost always go back to it. It doesn't take it doesn't take that long. Um, I started a fantasy science fiction book club in my town here in Morris, and, yeah, we get together every other month and talk about, a book, in one of those genres. So, yeah, I don't know, some people think that fantasy and science fiction is just escapism, and that it maybe can be vacuous. I think that's a pretty outdated term if you really or an outdated kind of notion, because if you look at some of the really interesting and thought-provoking books that authors are writing these days and have been writing for for decades, um, it's I mean, you can hold those up to any of the classic, literary books in my opinion, right? I mean, there's good, fantasy and science fiction, there's great science fiction and fantasy, there's kinda not so good, there's derivative fantasy and science fiction, but there's also great mysteries, there's also mystery books that aren't so great, there's straight fiction that's like, "Oh, it's not that." I mean, so, I think for a long time, fantasy and science fiction, they were kind of, looked down upon. And I think that's changing sort of like I know you have a love for superheroes and movies and that kind of thing, a little bit.
Just a
Um,
little bit.
and but for a long time, right, it's like those were kind of like, "Oh, that's kids," and now that's in the mainstream. And I think, in general, fantasy and science fiction, um, has a lot more credibility, and, I think I mean, that's a good thing. I think that opens the doors, for, more creators and more people to enjoy it. It's used to be when I was growing up, like I used to play D&D, um, I used to kind of do kind of these nerdy things, right? And it's like, you didn't tell everybody, you just did it in your own little group. And now it's like you can be a big whatever comic nerd, D&D nerd, whatever nerd, and it's just accepted. I think that's really cool. I mean, we obviously as a society have a lot of issues that we need to address and are struggling with, but I think there's definitely a lot more acceptance in terms of, hey, this is what I like. And it's like, all right, good for you.
Yeah, that's what makes it so great is that film can be subjective, and we
Right.
can all kind of like certain things. Obviously, some more than others for certain reasons. To me, I guess what speaks to me most about like science fiction and fantasy is the ones that really stand the test of time, or the ones that really either like touch on like the human condition in a
Mhm.
sense, or in a way kind of draw a parallel to what's
Right.
happening in our real world. Yes, it takes place as escapism, like in its own in its own world, right? In its own universe, but in a way it's still we can relate to it because there's certain themes in there that tie into like what we are going through in the present, or we have recently gone through in the past,
Right. Yeah,
you
I
know?
mean, Stephen R. Donaldson, I mentioned before, he's his kind of aim in writing is to explore what it means to be human, right? Um, and I think the best literature, the best films, the best music, kind of they kind of help us explore as individuals, like what does it mean to be human? Because I mean, that's what we're all doing. We're like, who am I? What does it mean? Why am I here? Love, death, all that stuff, right? So I think that's what great works of art will do. But they can also entertain, right? You can have both, right? So they're not mutually exclusive.
Absolutely. And I know you mentioned The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell, who's famous for like the hero's journey, right?
Right,
Um, I know George Lucas has mentioned in the past that his original trilogy of Star Wars, and I guess you could say the prequel trilogy as well, but his Star Wars movies in general were like heavily based on Joseph Campbell's philosophy in terms of the hero's journey. And I
right.
know you're a big Star Wars guy, right?
I like Star Wars. Yeah, yeah. I mean the 4, 5, and 6 probably more than some of the others. But yeah, no, yeah, Star Wars made a huge impact on me. Yeah, and I Lucas was heavily influenced by Joseph Campbell and that hero's journey. Kind of the idea that there are there are heroes and these heroic stories that have been told through different cultures over time, um, but they have these shared experiences, right? Heroes go on a journey and certain things happen in kind of these different stages. And I think, yeah, he definitely took some of those ideas and my wife and I have taught a course, we called it Myth from the Page to the Stage, at our university where we used Star Wars, as kind of a template for showing the hero's journey, right? Because that's been mapped out pretty well. So yeah, yeah, and when I was a kid, I was, let's see, how old was I? 12 years old when I saw Star Wars: A New Hope when it first came out in the movie theater, and I didn't know anything about Joseph Campbell, but there was definitely something about that movie that was elevating. Like, the special effects were cool. We'd never seen anything like it. Um But there was something else there, right? I think that was one of those movies, one of those stories that was tapping into something bigger and deeper. It's like even as a kid, when Luke he's trying to destroy that Death Star and he's has his computer on and he's trying to decide, if he should hit it or not. He hears that voice. And his mentor is saying, just let it go, right? So there was this like spiritual component to it, which I think only resonates more now with all the technology we have with AI and everything else. There's something more than just like our machines and our technology. Um, and that's part of exploring what it means to be human. Like I don't know exactly what that is. I'm not a hugely religious person, but I'm very spiritual. And so that's always kind of fascinated me.
Yeah, for me, like when I was growing up, it was Harry Potter.
Yeah,
Those movies are coming out, the books are coming out.
right.
It was the rage, and I would when the new book came out, I would always me and my sister and my mom, we would always take turns reading it, and um, watching the movies endless times, still do.
Right.
That was my
Yeah,
um, hero's journey per se when I was growing up. I
right.
could relate to Harry, I could relate to those characters, and um, just the world building was just incredible. And I
Yeah.
know J.K. Rowling kind of gets some flack online in a general these days. Um, Maybe justifiably so, depends who you ask. But
Mm,
yeah, to me, it doesn't take away from my enjoyment of the series. So
yeah. I gotta say, I was a little jealous because I was a librarian at the time those books were coming out, and I would have some of my elementary kids asking for them, and that kinda thing, and I thought, "How cool is it to have these books coming out kind of mirroring your own journey, right? It's like the characters are growing up as you're growing up. It's like you're maturing as these characters are maturing. And I just thought, that's just so incredible to be able to be to be there while these books are coming out. It's just magical. Yeah, but I know what you're saying, about some of the criticism of Rowling and yeah, I mean, we don't need to dive into that. I think some of that is valid. And I have talked to some people, some students where that really affects their enjoyment of it, of the books, right? Or the movies. But that all comes down to how, you know, can you, and everybody's different, can you divorce the person, the creator from the art they've created? Right? And that's kind of an individual thing, right? I mean, for some people, it's like you can talk about Woody Allen, right? And it's like, definitely it's made some great movies, very talented director, but with some of the controversies surrounding him, that can be that can be a no-go. It's like I can't see those movies anymore. And for other people, they're like, well, I'm not crazy about what that person did, and I have major problems with that or whatever, but they can still enjoy the art. And I mean, that's an individual decision, I think. It's everybody has their own lines that they draw, I guess.
yeah, I love the way you phrase that. How it's individual to the person who's watching it and experiencing it. I guess I haven't really thought of it in that way before, but yeah, that I love that phrasing because it provides a choice. It just doesn't have to be one side or the other. You know, yeah, I love that. That's awesome. That's great.
I think, as a culture, we become, I think, hopefully we're getting better in terms of our sensitivities, and we're educating ourselves, right, about different cultures and about, just different experiences, right? And, privilege and all that sort of thing. I mean, over the last 10, 20 years, there's been such a wonderful explosion of just, multicultural fantasy, especially, but also science fiction in those genres. And it really opened up, I think, different worlds. So it's not just this European kind of kind of fantasy, right? There's obviously so much more. And then different readers with different backgrounds can see themselves, in those stories, and I think that's really important. But I think equally so, there's stories that now may seem a little dated. Like, I grew up, like, kind of the '70s and '80s, and I read some of those stories, and yeah, you know, things, time moves on and things don't always age great. But there's still a lot of good literature that was created, fantasy and science fiction in those time periods. And I'm sure we'll look back 30 years from now, and we might look back at this time and go, oh, like, well, there'll be issues. I mean, that's just kind of how it goes, right? And I mean, but we're still reading Shakespeare. We're still, yeah, you know what I mean? So, I mean, if it's really good art, if it's art that's actually really saying something, then it's probably gonna give it longevity, right? Maybe in spite of the fact that, if it's a movie filmed in the '80s and somebody has big hair, but if the story's really good, maybe you can look past that, right? Or whatever it is. So, yeah.
Yeah, and certain trends come back around too. So, you
They
know,
do, yeah, they do.